In a
think
world
this
of
is a
power,
joke?
secrets,
You
and
think I
betrayal,
wanted this? You
one
ruined
moment
my
changes
life.
everything. At 30 weeks pregnant,
wait,
Claire
please
believed she was
don't.
building a future, until one shocking act shattered the illusion. Behind the polished image of a perfect marriage lay lies, manipulation, and a carefully orchestrated
You're
betrayal
finally
that had
here.
been unfolding for years.
I was so worried.
But when Claire finally
okay
uncovers
now,
the
Dad.
truth, she doesn't
We
break,
both are.
she rises. And what follows isn't just the fall of a man, it's the collapse of an empire and the rebirth of a woman who refuses to be silenced.
Please,
This
just give me
story
5
reminds us,
minutes. I didn't know where else to
sometimes
go.
the hardest truth to accept
said it's
is the
over,
one we've
James. You
always
need to
known
leave.
deep down. Ignoring red flags doesn't make them disappear. It only delays the moment they change everything. Walking away isn't weakness, it's courage. And choosing yourself may be the most powerful decision you ever make. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt real to your own journey, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel so we can keep bringing you more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
32 weeks into a high-risk pregnancy, Eleanor was confined to bed rest in their Seattle penthouse, a glass sanctuary overlooking the gray expanse of Puget Sound. A fetal Doppler sat on the bedside table, filling the silent room with the steady rhythm of her son's heartbeat, a constant 150, 150, 150. Her husband, Arthur, walked in. He didn't inquire about the doctor's latest warning concerning her blood pressure. His gaze didn't even flicker toward the machine broadcasting the sound of their child's life. He wanted to know why she'd flagged an expenditure from the company's private innovation fund. It was for a stealth project, he snapped. She told him the data trail she'd followed led to a waterfront condo in Medina, registered to one of his holding companies. He called her paranoid. Then his arm cut through the air, and the sharp report of his hand against her cheek reverberated off the panoramic windows, a violent crack in the home she once believed was their fortress. She flinched back, her own hand rising to the sudden blooming heat on her skin. The Doppler's rhythm was unbroken, 150, 150, the unwavering, innocent pulse of her unborn son. Her husband adjusted the collar of his designer jacket and left. With a trembling hand, she picked up her phone. She sent a message to her father containing only 4 words: "The code is compromised." The fallout over the next 48 hours would do more than shatter a marriage. It would threaten to liquidate a multi-billion-dollar AI empire on the brink of its IPO. Because the man who had just assaulted his pregnant wife had forgotten one crucial, devastating detail. Her father was the venture capitalist who had seeded his entire operation, waiting for a single, justifiable reason to trigger a catastrophic loss of faith. And she had just given him one. Stay with Eleanor. Because the story she uncovers about the 2 years leading to that single moment of violence is immeasurably more shattering than the physical blow itself. And the new world she builds from the digital ashes is the part of this journey you will never anticipate. Before we go on, this story is for anyone who has ever minimized their own brilliance to make a partner feel powerful, who has repeatedly debugged the red flags, who has held on to the idea of a person that was only a flawless projection. This story is proof that logging off from a life that was corrupting your spirit is not a system failure. It is the beginnings of a total reboot. If this resonates with you, if any fragment of this feels like a glitch you have experienced, seen, or endured in silence, please show your support by liking this video and leaving a comment. Tell us which part of the story connected with you the most. Your insights offer a network to others who feel they are facing their own battles offline. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new to our channel, subscribe and join our community. Every story we share is for women who are ready to reclaim their own narrative about what truly matters. You are why we are here. The fetal Doppler continued its calm electronic beat. It was completely indifferent to the storm gathering in the master suite of the penthouse that crowned the Nexus Tower. It just maintained its steady cadence, 150, 150, 150. Eleanor Vance was 32 weeks pregnant. She was propped up in a nest of pillows, the cool silk of her pajamas a stark contrast to the profound exhaustion that settled in her bones. Her blonde hair was tied back in a messy bun, and the strain of a difficult pregnancy, of stress-induced contractions, and of the sheer biological effort of creating a new life had etched dark smudges beneath her eyes. The private nurses had been a godsend. They anticipated her needs without asking, bringing her herbal tea when the Seattle mist turned to a driving rain against the windows. A nurse named Maria had sat with her for nearly an hour the previous night. Her gentle chatter about her garden, a warm, human firewall against the apartment's cold, integrated smart technology. The automated home system, by contrast, was relentless. It bathed every surface in a crisp, commercial-grade light. Eleanor was focused on the Doppler, on the sound of her son's heart. 150 beats per minute, strong, persistent, and entirely oblivious to the world he was about to join. She had been tracking that rhythm for almost an hour when the bedroom door slid open without a sound. Arthur Vance entered. He was 46, lean, and wearing the uniform of a tech oligarch. A ridiculously expensive cashmere hoodie, a crisp t-shirt, and minimalist sneakers that cost more than a mortgage payment. His phone was already glowing with a stream of notifications. He had come straight from a meeting with the board. He hadn't bothered to decompress or arrange his features into a mask of spousal concern. He offered no greeting. He didn't ask about their child. He tossed his keys into a leather tray on the dresser and shot the medical equipment a brief, annoyed look. His attention was singular, and it was aggressive. "Why are you running queries on the discretionary fund?" It was not a question. It was an accusation. The opening move from a man who had already decided she was the opposition. Eleanor simply looked at him. "Arthur," she started, her voice frail. "The doctor said my pressure is—" "I know what the doctor said," he cut in. "I'm asking why you're acting like a forensic auditor, requesting access to sealed expense reports. The CFO said you were trying to bypass his authority." "I didn't request anything, and your CFO is exaggerating." The atmosphere in the room turned colder. Not a sudden frost, but a slow, creeping chill. It was the kind of pressure change that signals an imminent system crash. Arthur locked his gaze on her. "Do not question my CFO," he said, his voice dangerously low. It was the tone he used right before dismantling a competitor during a hostile takeover. A quiet that was far more threatening than shouting because it meant the outcome was already a foregone conclusion. "Arthur, I designed the ethical oversight algorithms for Nexus. I know that a private consultation fee—" She stopped. He glanced at the Doppler, at the sound flooding the space between them. 150. His eyes snapped back to her, filled with an expression she had spent 5 years learning to decode. It was the look that meant his mind was running scenarios, evaluating risks, and calculating the most efficient way to regain control. "You're making me look weak," he said. "You saw a transaction you didn't recognize, and instead of having faith in my leadership, you started cross-referencing payment logs. It's insubordinate. A $200,000 monthly retainer for an art curator isn't a project, Arthur. It's an allowance. It was a strategic acquisition. You were not meant to be involved. You are on medical leave. You used your founder's credentials to spy from our bedroom. And you are undermining my authority right before we go public. Because you were about to use corporate funds to purchase a home for another woman. That is no longer a variable you need to consider." The silence that fell was thick and heavy, filled with every debate they had ever tabled. Eleanor focused on the Doppler. 150. 150. She drew a shallow breath. "You're right," she murmured, feeling a small, essential piece of her own foundation crack as she uttered the words. "I should have trusted you. I'm sorry." She watched his face, searching for the usual sign, that slight easing of the muscle in his jaw that meant the conflict was resolved. This was their algorithm. She would concede, he would become magnanimous. The tension would dissipate. Their world would reset. But this time, the pattern broke. "The investors are becoming concerned," he said, "about your temperament, your focus. They're worried your current emotional state is a liability." "My emotional state?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Arthur, I am 32 weeks pregnant with our son. This is not an emotional state. I am trying to protect this company, he said, his voice dropping to the register that meant, for him, the conversation was terminated. At least, his part was. Your emotional state is becoming a liability I have to deal with on top of closing a $500 million merger. Her entire being screamed, "Don't react, let it blow over, just wait for the hurricane to pass." It was a mantra that had shielded her for years. She repeated it silently now, lying in their bed, 8 months pregnant with a child whose future depended on her stillness. But then she noticed his tablet on the nightstand. The screen glowed to life, an email notification preview. The words were impossible to misread. "Simone, the custom chandelier for the foyer is breathtaking. You are a true visionary." He wasn't even trying to be careful anymore. She said, "Simone is an unqualified leech draining this company, and you're letting her." The strike came from his right side. It was not a fist. It was not a desperate push. It was the flat, open palm of his hand, connecting with her cheek with sickening speed. The sound was a crisp, ugly crack, a defilement of the space meant to welcome their new baby. It wasn't a blow meant to cause injury. It was a blow meant to assert control, to terminate the conversation, to win. For 3 long, heart-stopping seconds, the world went silent. The fetal heart monitor did not. 142, 142, 142. Eleanor's hand moved slowly toward her own face, her actions feeling distant, as if her mind was refusing to process what had just occurred. The panic alarm in her mind blared. Her hand was pressed flat against the warmth of her belly, a solid point in a world that was suddenly spinning. This was really happening. In the tense quiet that followed, Arthur stood near the bedroom door, deliberately fastening the clasp of his watch. He performed the action with the same cold efficiency he used when firing an underperforming executive. A quick, clean, final gesture. The front door chimed. Beatrice, her older sister, walked in, holding a slim laptop and a folder. A senior partner at her accounting firm by 36, she'd spent the last decade specializing in forensic audits. She had seen the immaculate books of hopeful startups and the fraudulent ledgers of collapsing empires. Beatrice possessed an unnerving talent for sensing the hidden financial stress fractures in any situation. She felt one now. Her face did something incredible. It went perfectly, professionally blank, a mask of detached analysis clicking into place for a split second before a wave of sisterly worry replaced it so fast you could have missed it. "Arthur," she stated, her voice calm and level, "I need to speak with my sister for a few minutes before you leave." Arthur's eyes shifted from Beatrice to Eleanor. He grabbed his briefcase from the hall table, his gaze pointedly avoiding his wife's. He tucked his tablet under his arm. He crossed the marble floor, pulled open the heavy oak door, and was gone. The leather soles of his Italian loafers made no sound. The deadbolt clicked into place with a quiet, decisive thud. In 2 long steps, Beatrice was at her side. She said nothing. She perched on the edge of the antique chaise lounge, her actions methodical as she took Eleanor's hand, her thumb finding the frantic pulse in her wrist. She glanced at the second counter on her own watch, 118 beats per minute, dangerously high. Beatrice studied Eleanor's pale complexion, the rapid pulse visible in the hollow of her neck. She placed her laptop on the mahogany coffee table. She asked, her voice soft but firm, "Eleanor, tell me precisely what I can do for you right now." Eleanor stared past her, looking out at the vast, choppy waters of Lake Michigan. Their Chicago penthouse was silent. The city murmured 1,000 feet below. The baby gave a slow, deliberate turn inside her, an innocent shift from a child who had no idea his entire world had just been fractured. Eleanor thought, "I knew. Some small, quiet part of me always knew this entire structure was compromised." She thought, "I just never imagined this is how it would collapse." She thought, "I am 7 months pregnant, in my own home, and my husband just invented a zoning board emergency so he could leave for a development conference with his interior designer. She looked at Beatrice. "Call father," she said, her voice as fragile as ice. "Marcus Thorne, tell him Arthur just triggered the infidelity clause in the trust." Marcus Thorne had built fortunes for manufacturing dynasties, turning a small family tool and die shop into a global industrial powerhouse. He had achieved this over 40 years with a peerless eye for acquiring undervalued assets, a reputation for brutal negotiations, and the courage to invest when everyone else was running scared. He was in the middle of a tense union negotiation in his downtown Chicago office, only a 15-minute drive from his daughter's penthouse, when his secure line buzzed with her picture. He picked up before the first ring finished. Eleanor uttered only 7 words. "Dad, the design budget was a cover." Marcus Thorne replied, "I'm on my way." He was already standing. He ended the call, slid the encrypted phone into his suit jacket, gave a quiet, firm order to his stunned legal counsel, and strode out of the conference room. He didn't use the main elevator bank, but the private one that went straight to his garage. He was at the curb as his armored town car pulled up, the driver having anticipated the urgency in his employer's gate. 15-minute drive, 5-minute ride up. He arrived, his tailored suit jacket perfectly uncreased, his demeanor utterly composed. He let himself into the sprawling penthouse with his own security code and stopped cold. He saw his daughter's face, the shattered stillness in her eyes. One of her hands was laid protectively across the swell of her pregnancy. He recognized that look, the brittle calm of a person holding the pieces of their broken life together by sheer force of will. He walked across the enormous living room. He sat on the footstool across from her armchair. He carefully took her free hand in both of his. His grip was warm and solid. She remembered being 7 years old, completely convinced that no monster under the bed could ever get her as long as her father was holding her hand. She wasn't 7 anymore, but she clung to his hand just as fiercely. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice low, a controlled quiet that took immense effort. It was the calm of a man who knew his daughter needed an anchor, and he would become that anchor, no matter the storm of rage building within him. She told him about the expense reports, the late-night site visits, the faint scent of a different woman's perfume on his overcoat last month, the split second of confusion in his eyes when she'd asked him about it. Her fingers clenched over her belly as she finished her story. Marcus remained completely motionless. The digital clock on the mantel read 4 p.m., 4 p.m. "Have you had suspicions before this?" Marcus asked. Eleanor's prolonged silence was all the answer he needed. "Never with documentation," she whispered. Her eyes were locked on the tablet resting on the coffee table, still open to the incriminating line item for a $50,000 necklace, coded as custom lighting. "Not evidence. It was always just a bad feeling I couldn't explain away." Marcus didn't press her. He waited with the patience of a man who had lived 65 years and understood that a marriage doesn't implode on a timeline. And then the memories began to surface. Not in a straight line, but like a dam breaking. The kind of failure that happens when a structure, weakened by years of hidden cracks, finally gives way, and everything held back comes rushing out in a destructive, unstoppable torrent. The phone calls. The second year, they were married. He was obsessively private about his off-the-books phone, always keeping it face down, ending calls abruptly if she walked into his study. One night, she'd gotten up for a glass of milk around 3 a.m. and saw a sliver of light from under his study door. Arthur was on the terrace, bathed in the phone's glow, speaking in low, hushed tones. He'd turned, and they made eye contact. He showed no sign of guilt, no regret. He just met her gaze with that steady, impenetrable expression and said, "Just placating a city councilman. It's the cost of doing business," as if she were a junior associate. She hadn't known how to argue with him, so she had let it slide. The silence that followed buried the moment, and they went back to bed. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. She had rationalized it as the ugly side of his business. She had convinced herself that she, the daughter of an industrialist, understood the immense pressure he was under to perform. She had confused understanding his ambition for granting him her faith, and she had believed that unwavering faith was the bedrock of their marriage. She had been a fool about all of it. The charity auction, 3 years ago, the Museum of Contemporary Art's winter benefit. 400 of Chicago's wealthiest patrons surrounded by modern masterpieces. The staff was collecting the bidding paddles. As the daughter of a major donor, she had made a passionate point about the importance of funding arts education in public schools, a cause she was devoted to before Arthur convinced her to manage their family foundation, a position he'd described as streamlining our philanthropic footprint. It now felt like a gilded cage. She had made a sincere, heartfelt appeal. Arthur had laughed, not a quiet, supportive laugh, a loud, public, dismissive one, a public one for the entire board. He patted her arm in a dismissive gesture and said, "Eleanor has her pet theories about the machine," and then instantly pivoted the discussion to the company's recent patent filings, effectively silencing her as if she were a graduate student who just presented a thesis. 300 people in the room. She had maintained a stiff, polite smile. She had taken a measured sip of water. She did not bring up ethics again. She hardly spoke for the rest of the night. The pregnancy reveal. She had designed a simple, elegant program for his smart desk, and when he activated it, a progress bar would fill to 100% before displaying their baby's ultrasound with the text, "Project Legacy, launching in 6 months." She had imagined the moment for weeks, filled with the joyful, creative spark of engineering the perfect surprise. He had arrived home after midnight. He activated the desk. He saw the program run. He had looked at her and said, "Nice interface. Hey, I need you to proofread the keynote for the Singapore summit." Then he kissed her on the forehead and went into his office to take a video call. She had stood alone in the dark living room for a very long time, the screen glowing on his desk. She had compiled an entire list of justifications for him in her mind. He expresses love through work. He is building our future. My hormones are causing me to misinterpret the data. He's a passionate man. He just channels it all into his work. Ilara had built a fortress around her marriage with such flimsy justifications, living inside its gilded cage while willfully ignoring the hairline fractures spreading through its foundation. "Father," she started, her voice barely a whisper. Henry remained still, his silence a comforting weight in the swirling chaos of her mind. "I think. On some level, I always knew. I felt the instability in the ground we stood on." She drew a shaky breath. "I just kept hoping the man I fell in love with would find his way back." Henry's question was gentle, yet it shattered the fortress completely. "Are you certain that man was ever truly real?" The query hung in the vast, quiet living room of their penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. In that stillness, she realized a profound, permanent silence was about to settle over her life. She couldn't give him an answer because the truth, the one she was finally letting herself see, was devastatingly simple. She had no idea. She had spent years waiting for a memory to become a man again, never considering that he might have been a masterpiece of fiction from the start. "My God, what an absolute fool I've been," she murmured, the words escaping like a final breath. Every single warning sign was there. Henry didn't offer the cheap comfort that she wasn't a fool. He respected her too much to hand her a lie she'd have to discard, and he knew she didn't have the energy for that fight. He simply squeezed her hand a little tighter. Down in the building's limestone lobby, Diana Blackwood was stepping out of a black sedan. She sent a concise message to her junior partner, postponing a deposition for a high-stakes corporate espionage case. As the most sought-after litigator for Chicago's dynastic families, she was a master of strategic demolition and impenetrable discretion. She glanced at the time, 3:42 p.m. She registered the quiet urgency in the message she'd received from Henry Clark. Get to the penthouse. Ilara needs you. She registered the doorman's respectful nod, the way his eyes averted as she crossed to the private elevator. She knew this address. She had drafted the prenuptial agreement designed to insulate the assets associated with this exact residence. The discovery had been a result of due diligence, a routine review of the foundation's year-end financial statements. She had been confirming their charitable distributions, a simple act of fiscal oversight. She filed that moment away, a crucial piece of evidence. She had clicked on the line item for the Crestwood acquisition. For a long moment, she just stared at the numbers, her free hand resting protectively over the small swell of her belly. Then, tracing the wire transfer to a shell corporation, she found the deed to a Lincoln Park condominium, the architecture of a secret life she was never meant to discover. The life Arthur had been constructing in the shadows. Ilara saw the date of the final payment. It was from 38 minutes ago. She was 34 years old, and she was about to lose a husband who was very, very real. Henry Clark approached every problem as he had a federal court case, with methodical analysis, unassailable logic, and no room for emotional error. He had taken his daughter's call from his home study, surrounded by leather-bound law books. The conversation had lasted less than 60 seconds. He walked into the Gold Coast penthouse and stopped cold. He saw his daughter's face, pale and unnervingly calm, a delicate mask she was wearing to keep from falling apart, and the way she sat in a rocking chair in the half-assembled nursery, perfectly still, as if one sharp exhale would cause her to disintegrate. Henry set his briefcase down. His voice was low, layered with a frigid anger he had suppressed for years. I never trusted him, Ilara. Not for 1 second since the day you introduced him. Ilara looked up, her eyes hollow. I know. I'm finished being diplomatic about it. I know that too, she whispered. Henry knelt before his daughter on the silk rug, just as he had in her university library 14 years ago when they were 20, and betrayals of this magnitude were reserved for tragic literature. He didn't hug her, not yet. He simply stayed there, a solid, immovable object in the face of her collapsing world. After a beat, Ilara leaned forward, resting her forehead on his shoulder. The ship's clock on the mantel chimed 10 o'clock. Across the city, in his sprawling River North gallery, Arthur Vance ended his call. He scrolled through his phone and found the number. The connection was immediate. Julian, Arthur said. His voice had changed. It wasn't angry. It was heavy, like steel that had been quenched in ice. Harder, unbending. Clear your afternoon. I need you in my office, now. The private viewing room. And when you come, bring the entire file on the Crestwood Shell Corporation. Every last document. Julian Croft, his personal attorney, asked, What kind of fire are we putting out? He built an entire second life behind my daughter's back. She is 35 weeks pregnant. A dense silence filled the line for the space of 2 heartbeats. I'm 15 minutes out, Diana said. And Henry? Yes? I'm activating my forensic accounting team. It's best to have the weapons loaded before the war begins. Henry let out a breath that was a mixture of deep sorrow and colder resolve. Excellent, he said. He ended the call. He stood in the penthouse, the ambient noise of the city he had once helped govern drifting through the windows, the distant rumble of the L train, the mournful sound of a ship's horn on the lake, all of it fading behind a single, sharp, unyielding focus. The low hum of the building's climate control and the steady tick of the clock felt like a roar, and she gave herself 1 minute. She let the rage peak. A white-hot inferno she knew her father could not bear to witness. Then she banked the fire, smoothed the fabric of her silk maternity dress, and walked back into the living room. Diana Blackwood arrived in less than 20 minutes. She was 68 years old, her silver hair cut in an elegant, sharp bob, and she moved with the quiet confidence of a woman who had spent 4 decades dismantling the fortunes of Chicago's most powerful men, knowing that real authority never had to be loud. She placed her slim leather portfolio on the glass table and set a single file next to it. She exchanged a look with Henry that spoke of a long and successful history of difficult battles won. Then she turned to Elara with the warm, focused compassion of someone who had known her since she was a child and had no intention of treating this like just another case. She didn't open the file right away. "Before we discuss strategy," she said, her voice reassuring, "I need you to show me exactly what you found in those financial statements." Henry had called her an hour ago, his voice a low, restrained tremor of fury after Elara had told him what she'd unearthed that afternoon. She found it by accident with no intention of snooping. She was just trying to organize their shared digital files on the new server he'd installed in his home office, a simple task to streamline their lives. That's when she saw it. A partitioned drive named Project Icarus, which appeared alongside their public folders. He'd mentioned it was a personal passion project, a solo design competition. Curious, she clicked it. There was no password. The files inside were not for a competition. It was a new skyscraper, a new architectural firm he was launching in Dubai. This was the venture he'd been so secretive about, the project that required all those late-night design sessions that kept him at the office. The drive was full of renderings and financial models for a futuristic tower, a vision so massive and ambitious it felt, for the first time in her marriage, like a world where she didn't belong. The incorporation papers had been filed 6 weeks ago. The co-founder listed was not her. She knew the arrogant, sweeping flourish of his signature anywhere, the sharp line through the J of his first name. Beside it, an equally confident S and R, Serafina Reyes, his name, printed with absolute certainty on the charter for a company he had described as his legacy. She remembered the weight in his voice when he'd used that word. Her second trimester had been a welcome relief, bringing a wave of energy she'd almost forgotten. Julian had spread a thick stack of documents across their polished marble island, next to the sparkling water she now drank constantly. He'd said their financial advisor had found a way to structure a new LLC for their real estate holdings, a simple move to reduce their tax burden. He'd called it routine estate planning. She had placed her pen where his finger tapped. She had believed him. The AT, her lawyer Marcus said gently, stands for the Apex Trust. The documents you signed didn't restructure your assets. They authorized the transfer of your entire premarital real estate portfolio to fund it. Upon the filing of a separation, he continued, his eyes scanning the page, it activates a clause that assigns his controlling interest in Croft architecture to this new entity. It also approves the sale of all your joint properties to provide its operating capital, leaving you with what the document refers to as a 10-year spousal stipend. He quoted the sum. Eleanor felt a cold stillness. Furthermore, it redefines marital property, Marcus went on, to exclude all intellectual property and design awards acquired during the marriage, assets that, under your prenup, are jointly owned 50-50. The nursery down the hall was quiet. David, her brother, stood by the window, his knuckles white as he stared down at the city streets. Her brother was staring out at the vast Chicago skyline. He called it our dynasty, Eleanor whispered. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was the flat, deadened sound of a fact clicking into place. The sound of a person accepting a reality so total it incinerates all other feeling. The timeline of the wire transfers, Marcus said, which my forensic accountant flagged this morning when laid over the trust incorporation date, reveals a very clear sequence. This was a methodical financial and personal extraction, fully orchestrated. He called it our dynasty, Eleanor repeated. Her voice was just as quiet, but now it held a new, hard edge, like granite. Marcus said, the silver lining is, his arrogance made him careless. You signed that asset transfer under the false pretense that it was a standard tax strategy. His claim that it was for your family's estate planner is a provable lie. I confirmed with your wealth manager less than an hour ago. He knows nothing about this trust. He was never brought in. He let that hang in the air, Moreover, your brother's original agreement when he established your trust fund stipulates that my initial endowment to establish Eleanor's property portfolio was secured with a personal guarantee from Julian against his entire personal and corporate net worth, her brother said, his back still to the room. That guarantee is non-revocable. I know, Marcus confirmed. What do you want to do? A court injunction, effective immediately, to freeze every single asset. His firm, his personal accounts, the joint holdings, everything. And I need Eleanor's formal consent to file. Both the lawyer and her brother turned to face her. She was holding her tablet, looking at a glossy feature on them in an architecture magazine, a knight she had felt like his partner, his equal, his collaborator. A night she had worked the room relentlessly, trying to be the perfect wife who was an asset to her husband's brilliant vision. She switched the screen off. You have it, she said. Marcus gave a single, decisive nod. He snapped his leather folio shut. He started toward the door. Marcus, Eleanor said. The lawyer paused. The firm, the money, the other woman. She took a deep, centering breath. How long has he been doing this? Marcus was silent for a moment. Judging by the metadata on the earliest design files from his server, he said, the initial concept was created at least 18 months ago. Eleanor nodded once. The lawyer left. David waited until he heard the elevator doors slide shut, then spoke, his voice lower than she'd ever heard it, every word spoken with deliberate force. Ellie. I know, she answered. I need to be sure that you know that I know David. Her brother David crossed the vast living room and put his arms around her, holding her firmly without saying anything more, because there was nothing left to say, and he understood that. Her mother came away from the floor-to-ceiling windows. She sat on the arm of the sofa and put a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. The three of them remained like that as the city lights began to sparkle outside, and the dusk cast long shadows across the limestone floors. Eleanor's gaze landed on a paint swatch for the nursery, a soft, pale gray. 18 months, she thought. A year and a half of shared meals, of planning a room for their child, of building a life with a man who was simultaneously drafting a different future without her in it. A year and a half she spent believing they were a single, cohesive unit, while he was quietly vetting her replacement. A year and a half of her overriding her own professional instincts, of making herself more accommodating, telling herself it was just what it meant to be a supportive partner. I compromised my own design for him, she thought. For 5 years, I softened my lines, scaled back my own plans, made myself easier to build around, and I convinced myself that was love. It was not love. It was a complete demolition. I helped him tear down my own structure, and I called it being a good wife. This was not an emotional collapse. She could differentiate the impulse for self-blame from the cold, structural facts. In the past hour, she had moved to the side of pure fact, and she intended to build her new life there. The baby stirred within her, a slow, insistent roll that felt like a silent confirmation. Asterisk, we are still standing. We too are still here. Eleanor laid a hand over her stomach. I know, she whispered. We are going to be fine. She didn't know if that was true, but she said it out loud anyway, with the conviction that some foundations have to be spoken into existence before they can be built. For the next 5 minutes, the penthouse was hers alone. Her father, a titan of industry, had gone into the study with her brother. A caterer had entered and silently removed a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres. Dr. Chen had checked the baby's heartbeat with a handheld monitor, offered a reassuring nod, and left with the placid, unreadable face of a professional who observes everything and says nothing. The room became quiet. The digital clock on the integrated home system marked the time in silence. The city provided a low hum, the distant rumble of a train, the siren of an ambulance many blocks away, the muffled cadence of a conference call happening down the hall. She would not let herself think about legal strategy. She would not let herself blueprint her next move. She simply sat with the new reality, completely still, the way an architect must stop to understand the ground before they can even begin to build. She watched her baby's heartbeat pulse on the small screen. 149. Steady, strong, a life entirely her own. Miles away, in his high-rise office with a view of the entire lakefront, Julian Croft's phone began to vibrate and did not stop. The first message was from his head of IT security. * Julian, call me immediately. We have a permissions breach on the Icarus project servers. The second was from the chairman of the City Zoning Commission. The third was from the same chairman, this time marked urgent. The fourth was not a message. It was a push notification from an industry journal, a headline that was just background noise until it was suddenly the most important sentence in the world. * Crestwood, Industries dissolves Croft Architecture Partnership, citing fundamental fiduciary breach. Statement by David Crestwood. Julian read it. He read it a second time. He called security. They're revoking our access to the digital blueprints, his guy said, his voice tight. Someone is executing the emergency intellectual property clause for the entire Dubai project, and at the same time, the money? Julian interrupted. The gallery's chief financial officer told him the amount. A 3-second pause hung on the line. 3 seconds was an eternity for Arthur Vance to be silent. He said, "Have the car ready at the main entrance." He made it from his River North gallery to their Gold Coast penthouse in under 30 minutes. He used the drive to recalibrate. It was a talent he had honed over 2 decades of selling art to the ultra-wealthy, the rapid assessment of a disaster, the quick identification of any remaining leverage, and the precise calibration of the emotional performance required for the audience he was about to face. He also made a quick mental note to clear his laptop's search history. The cool leather of the private elevator seat pressed against his back as he ascended to their floor, his phone held loosely in his hand, the other clenching and unclenching as he read his mistress's increasingly frantic messages about the Crestwood funds being frozen. He pocketed the phone as the doors chimed. He walked down the corridor with the steady, confident stride of a man who believed that any reality could be altered if one simply narrated it with enough force. He had not expected to see Henry Clark in the great room. Arthur paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene. Julian, his own lawyer, stood stiffly by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a sleek black laptop. Henry was seated in an armchair beside Alara's, and Alara herself, surrounded by plush cushions, her hands resting on her stomach with a serenity he hadn't seen in their entire 5-year marriage. He glanced down at his own empty hands. He entered the room, placed his briefcase by the door, and chose to remain standing by the fireplace. To sit would be to capitulate, to accept that the new power dynamic in the room was already set. "Henry," he began, his voice exuding the patient warmth of a man arriving to clear up a simple misunderstanding. "Diana, I'm glad you're here. I was just on my way home. Ilara and we've had an incredibly taxing few weeks. I just want to ensure everyone understands the full picture before we—" "What part of the picture do you imagine we're missing, Arthur?" Henry asked, his eyes fixed on the screen of the laptop in front of him. Arthur's jaw clenched, an almost imperceptible twitch. Ilara has been under a tremendous amount of pressure. The pregnancy, the Foundation's annual gala, the pressure from the last funding round. It's been intense for us both. We had a stupid fight, and I said things in a way that I completely Julian? Elena's voice was soft, but it sliced through the room with the clean, cold edge of surgical steel. No waver, no warmth. He looked up at her. She said, "You bought the commission from the Renault Gallery." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Julian's eyes darted to the notifications on his phone's lock screen. He had set up their Onyx card with linked accounts himself, a seamless integration of their finances. It had never crossed his mind that the instant transaction alerts would appear on her master profile just as they did on his. He was certainly thinking about it now. She saw his mind racing, running the scenarios. She used to find that agile intellect, that raw processing power, so captivating. She watched him analyze the variables, calculate the exposure, and begin to architect a new story that could contain the damage. "Elena," he started, his voice shifting to a lower, more persuasive register, the one he used for late-night investor calls in their box at the Symphony, in all the beautiful, minimalist spaces he had designed for their life. It was the voice she once believed was the sound of their empire being coded into existence. "Whatever line item you think you saw this afternoon, we are not workshopping this," she stated, her tone final. He froze. "Not for one more cycle," she added. "Ever." In 8 years, she had never spoken to him with such profound, unassailable certainty. Uttering the words cost her an ocean of grief, but the moment they were spoken, a small, vital piece of her own core programming reasserted itself, solid and unbreachable and entirely hers. Her father stood. Marcus Vance was not a large man, but he possessed the immense quiet gravity of a Silicon Valley institution. When Marcus Vance looked at you, you felt the entire weight of the venture capital world. "Here is the new protocol," Marcus said, using the same calm, declarative tone he used to open a board meeting. "Our lawyers filed an ex parte motion 90 minutes ago to freeze all community assets. The blockchain ledger is quite transparent. You will vacate this penthouse. You will have no further contact with Elena, direct or indirect. All future communications will be routed through Mr. Harrison's firm." Julian began to say, "This is an absurd Furthermore," Marcus continued, "Vance Capital is officially invoking the personal conduct clause in our Series C term sheet and is withdrawing all funding for Project Chimera, effective immediately. The funding agreement is now null and void. A digital notice is being delivered to your executive board as we speak." A flicker went through Julian's expression. Not panic. Julian Thorne didn't do panic, but a catastrophic system failure, a core corruption that went far deeper than the first. It was the kind that wiped out the entire operating system of his world. The funding, the key person integrity provision his own legal team had dismissed as standard VC boilerplate. The clause that had, 5 years ago, felt like the ultimate vote of confidence from his future father-in-law, a sign of two great tech dynasties merging. He finally saw it for what it had always been, a fiber optic leash held by an incredibly patient man. "You can't," Julian said. "The term sheet has no provision for a unilateral—" "The agreement, mister," Harrison said, looking up from his datapad for the first time, "contains a reputational risk clause tied to any executive action that could inflict financial or public relations damage on the company. When a CEO wires a sum of $150,000 from a corporate account to a private art gallery for the personal acquisition of a piece for a curator on his staff, with every part of the transaction logged on an immutable public ledger. Now our counsel is quite certain this constitutes a material breach of fiduciary duty." A moment of complete stillness settled in the room. "Our team is prepared to move forward with litigation immediately," Harrison added. Julian's eyes were locked on Elena. She held his gaze, her own face a mask of placid resolve. He could find no trace of victory or pain there, only a certainty that was harder and more permanent than either emotion. She was like an architect watching a controlled demolition from a safe distance, fully aware of the structure's impending collapse, but clear of the dust and the fallout. I deserved a co-founder, she thought, and the idea felt elemental and solid and true. From the very beginning, I deserved a true partner. "This is a choice you will regret for the rest of your life," Julian hissed. She replied, "My life has had its share of bad code. This is a patch, not a bug." He turned sharply and walked out. The heavy penthouse door swung shut behind him. A single perfect white orchid sat in a vase on the console table. No one looked at it. It remained in its minimalist container, its flawless petals catching the afternoon light filtering in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silent testament to a perfection that was no longer real. The housekeeper entered less than a minute later. She had obviously been waiting in the hall. She placed 2 cups of steaming green tea on the table by the sofa. Her gaze shifted from the orchid to Elena, then to Elena's father, Marcus, before she asked in the low, steady tone of someone who has seen a company pivot one final time, "Well, is the reset complete?" Elena looked at her father, then at Harrison, who was already speaking quietly into his phone in the corner, and finally back at the housekeeper. She said, "It's complete." And for the first time since that morning, a sensation other than cold dread began to spread through her. It was a faint, persistent warmth, originating deep within her, that seemed to pulse in time with the quiet, steady rhythm of her unborn child's life. It belonged only to her. The housekeeper handed her a cup. The matcha was a ceremonial grade, whisked just right, with the precise amount of oat milk she preferred. Elena said nothing. She cupped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her skin. In a parking garage in the financial district, Julian Thorne was already on a call. "What's the damage?" Julian demanded. His COO, Mark, answered, "Our server farm partners are citing the force majeure clause, and the board just called an emergency session. Pre-market trading is already halted. The contagion is spreading faster than kill the city data sharing initiative," Julian interrupted. "The supervisors will hear the rumors. They'll use it as an excuse to block the permits." "Just kill it, Mark." There was a beat of silence. "I'm on my way," Marcus said, his voice tight. He disconnected the call. He stood in the glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor, looking down at the Chicago River, thinking about the 15 years he'd dedicated to Julian Thorne. He thought of every zoning variance he'd navigated, every city official he'd placated, and every permit he'd expedited without a second thought because his job was to clear the path. He grabbed his coat. He had a Category 5 hurricane to try and walk back. Julian Thorne didn't deal in feelings. He dealt in blueprints and ambition. He had built Thorne Development over 20 years on 2 simple rules: envision the skyline no one else can, and break ground before they see it too. He could charm a zoning board and finalize a billion-dollar project with a handshake that left seasoned rivals breathless. His entire empire was built on that audacious vision. By the time Julian's car slid into its reserved spot beneath the gleaming Thorne Tower, the Blackwood Foundation had already circulated a formal memo to the hospital's board of trustees. It mentioned an irreparable breach of personal and professional ethics and a grave conflict compromising the integrity of the capital campaign. 2 of Harrison's most formidable attorneys had spent the last 4 hours perfecting the wording. It was surgical. It was irrefutable. It made no mention of an affair or a secret downtown apartment. It didn't need to. The city's elite would fill in the blanks. The wire transfers Elara's advisor had found were, of course, a private issue, but the potential implosion of a 9-figure donation for the city's most anticipated new medical wing was a civic event that demanded immediate scrutiny. A lead investigative journalist at the Chicago Tribune received an anonymous tip at 2:45 p.m. She was exceptionally skilled at her profession. She made 4 calls. She confirmed 2 critical pieces of information off the record and attributed the rest to a source deep within the city's philanthropic circle. 1,000 words, devastating. By 4:30 p.m., it was the top story on the Tribune's website. By 5, it was the talk of the financial news circuit. By 6, it had earned 100,000 clicks. Julian's PR team fired back a response at 5:50. This is a baseless attack from a third party attempting to leverage a private family matter to disrupt a landmark civic project. The statement was quoted widely. The phrase private family matter, however, released while the expectant mother was under strict medical observation at home, tethered to a blood pressure monitor, landed with a sickening thud. By 10 p.m., the story had been shared over 300,000 times. Elara was finally unhooked from the monitor at 3 o'clock. The alarming blood pressure spikes had stabilized. Dr. Evelyn Reed reviewed the machine's printout, gesturing to the jagged peaks over the last 72 hours and then to the subsequent plateau. In the calm, professional tone of a lifelong physician, she noted the improvement was due to the cessation of exposure to a primary stressor. Standing at the doorway of the master suite, she took Ilara's hand. "You page me," she instructed, her voice both gentle and commanding. "For anything you or this baby need. I am not kidding." Ilara squeezed her hand, her mind searching for a way to voice the depth of her gratitude, but the words wouldn't form. She managed a tiny, shaky nod. Dr. Reed understood completely. Her father, Harrison, drove her to the Blackwood family's sprawling Gold Coast residence, the house where she'd grown up. As they passed through the wrought iron gates, she saw it, the familiar gas lanterns flanking the entrance, the ancient oak trees her grandmother had fought to protect, and the warm light from the library windows holding back the encroaching evening mist from Lake Michigan. She sat motionless in the passenger seat of her father's sedan. For a full 5 minutes after her father silenced the engine, she stayed in that passenger seat. She felt physically incapable of moving. It wasn't dread or indecision. It was the bone-deep knowledge that the house before her was the life she used to have, and the moment she stepped inside, she would be living in the world that came after. She needed a few more seconds in the quiet space between those two realities. Harrison sat with her. He didn't ask questions or glance at his watch. He just shared the silence with her in the twilight of the cobblestone driveway, the same way he had been there for every other crisis in her life, a steady, silent, and absolute presence. After 5 minutes, she finally opened the door. Eleanor Blackwood was waiting for them in the grand foyer. At 65, with her salt and pepper hair in a chic bob, she possessed the serene authority of a woman who, after 4 decades with Harrison Blackwood, could assess the scale of a disaster in a single glance. She looked at her daughter's face and simply opened her arms. The embrace was instant, wordless, and total. Her mother smelled of lavender and old paper, and beneath it, the unmistakable scent that had always meant safety. Ilara pressed her face into her mother's cashmere wrap and finally let herself shatter. It wasn't a loud or dramatic collapse. It was a quiet dissolving, the kind that happens when you've been holding yourself together by pure will and have finally reached the one place on earth where that effort is no longer necessary. Eleanor just held her. She didn't rush her or offer hollow reassurances that everything would work out. She was too wise and too realistic to make promises about a future her daughter couldn't even begin to imagine. She just held on. After the first wave of grief subsided, they moved to the kitchen. Eleanor started the kettle for Earl Grey tea. The room smelled just as it always had. The familiar dark cherry cabinets, the sweeping view of the manicure gardens through the leaded glass windows, and a small board with cheese and grapes on the marble island. A quiet offering Eleanor always made when one of her family members needed something solid to ground them. They sat at the table. They did not mention Julian. They steered clear of any talk of lawyers or the looming financial storm. Instead, Eleanor began a long, detailed story about a feud with the head of the city's symphony over his choice of a controversial new composer. A faint smile touched Ilara's lips. It was a start. On the other side of town, the mood was starkly different. The tension in the executive suite of Thorne Development was a palpable force. Julian was there, with his 3 senior partners, his head of PR, and his top 2 lawyers conferenced in on a secure line. There was no yelling. Julian would never allow for such a loss of control, but there was the sharp, brittle silence that descends when intelligent people grasp the full scope of a self-inflicted wound. The news that the Blackwood Foundation was triggering the morality clause to halt all work on the new hospital pavilion wasn't, by itself, a financial death sentence. Thorne Development could absorb the loss and, with some clever repositioning, find new anchor projects. The devastating blow was the message it sent. The Blackwood family does not simply sever a 9-figure civic partnership without an unimpeachable reason. That was an unwritten rule in the closed ecosystem of Chicago's business elite. When Harrison Blackwood sent a brief message citing a complete loss of trust in the project's leadership to the board, Other partners took notice. They weren't panicking, they were calculating professionals who knew Harrison Blackwood's reputation for integrity had been spotless for 40 years. Notice led to phone calls, and phone calls led to formal reviews. By 9 o'clock that evening, both a major university and a powerful international arts foundation announced they were putting all future collaborations with Thorne Development under review. By 10, the industry blogs were buzzing with rumors. Leo, Julian's oldest partner, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering chain of lights along Lakeshore Drive. He thought of the 20 years he and Julian had spent building the firm from a 2-room office. He thought of all the design meetings where Julian had publicly dismissed one of Elara's insightful critiques on public space aesthetics, only to present the same idea as his own to a client the next day. He thought of the 1,000 tiny cuts a person can inflict to slowly diminish their own spouse. He replayed every time he had convinced himself it wasn't his business to intervene. Turning away from the city lights, he spoke into the suffocating silence. His voice was steady, filled with the clarity of a man who had just decided his own name was worth more than his stake in the company. Julian, this isn't a PR issue. You need to look at the flawed blueprint of your own life. The atmosphere in the suite grew impossibly heavy. Julian just stared back at Leo, his expression like granite. The look was pure ice. A predatory assessment that carried a threat louder than any shout. He said, "You're off the Skyline Tower project, David." David picked up his leather portfolio from the floor and his coat from the back of the chair. He looked at Julian one last time, a gaze filled with a profound disillusionment for the mentor he once revered and now failed to recognize. "I can live with that," he replied. Then turned and walked out. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. No one spoke. Julian turned back to the enormous 3-dimensional model of the city that covered the conference table. He meant to point to the site for a new waterfront acquisition. "We move on," he commanded, his voice a flawless performance of authority. His hand was rock steady as he reached out, but his finger brushed against a smaller model of a mid-rise, sending it skittering across the miniature grid until it toppled into the Chicago River. It looked like a foundational crack in the landscape. Not a single person in the room dared to breathe, because no one wanted to be the one to point out the obvious. Miles away, in a sleek River North gallery, a woman named Sasha stood among sculptures, her face lit by the glow of her tablet. She was 29. She had been, or had told herself she had been, the grammar of it all suddenly feeling so impossibly fragile. Julian Thorne's partner for 2 years. She knew he was married when they began. He had explained it on their 3rd date with a cool pragmatism that felt both worldly and reasonable. The marriage was a legacy merger, a joining of 2 real estate empires that was emotionally defunct, maintained only until a labyrinth of family trusts could be untangled. A business arrangement. She had accepted it. She had accepted all of it. Now she was looking at a document he had insisted she execute that very morning. She remembered his intense call, his voice strained with a kind of urgency she'd never heard before. "The new Arts Acquisition Trust needs to be finalized today," he had pushed. "Just sign the charter for the holding company. It's to protect your gallery's independence." A new investment vehicle, he'd called it, a necessary firewall to shield her gallery from the blowback of his messy family asset division. She stared at the agreement on her screen, at the dense fiduciary liability clause she'd nearly skimmed over. Some deep, unshakable instinct had made her forward the final version to her lawyer before signing. Now she understood why. He wasn't trying to protect her gallery. He was trying to make it his financial bunker. The pristine architecture of the life she'd built had just been condemned. Elena let the devastating truth settle in, a block of ice forming in her chest. She opened a private browser on her tablet. She searched for Marcus Thorne, the cutthroat divorce attorney she'd read about in a profile on Chicago's most feared litigators. She found his direct line. Elena's thumb hovered over the call button for what felt like an eternity before she finally pressed down. Marcus Thorne answered at 10:15 that night. He was in his home office, of course, because Marcus was never really off the clock when a war was about to begin. He listened, absorbing every detail without interruption. He asked only 2 incisive questions. He thanked Sophie, assured her she had made the correct choice, and promised to be in touch by 9 a.m. the next day. Marcus then phoned David. David called Elena. Elena was at her family's sprawling lake house in Lake Geneva, in a sunroom she'd loved since she was a girl. It had the same warm, buttery yellow walls she'd once called old-fashioned, a color she now found deeply comforting. She had slept, a heavy and mercifully dreamless sleep, from midnight until 8. She had been absolutely sure she would stare at the ceiling all night, her mind a frantic mess of betrayal and fear. But some primal part of her had taken over, an animal seeking shelter before the storm hit. She was curled on the cushioned bench of a bay window, watching the sunrise paint the calm surface of the lake, when her brother's call came through. Her mother was already down by the water, tending to her wildflower garden, with the intense focus of someone bringing order to a world spun into chaos. "That executive assistant, Sophie, she called Marcus Thorne last night," David said, his voice level and serious. Elena processed the words. "What did she tell him?" Elena asked. "She wants to help," he said after a pause. "Tell me everything," she said. And this was what Sophie had found, never imagining the monstrous design she was uncovering. A year and a half of a covert and meticulously planned campaign. A mislabeled binder in a secure off-site storage facility, codenamed the Legacy Trust, which was, in fact, an elaborate strategy to manufacture a case for her mental incompetence. There was a detailed timeline for liquidating shared assets into untraceable shell corporations, scheduled to be completed 1 week before her due date. There were printed emails between Julian and his private counsel from over a year ago, workshopping the exact legal phrasing that would depict Elena's passion for her architectural history research as a dissociative obsession and fiscal recklessness. And there were printed messages from a secure app where Julian detailed his plan to sue for sole custody, claiming her inability to distinguish between academic pursuits and reality made her an unstable parent. He had been planning her ruin before their son was even a possibility. Marcus Thorne relayed the information to Elena over the phone. He presented the facts with the detached precision of a surgeon, free of any emotional inflection, because he knew that what Elena needed most was the cold, unvarnished truth. When he was done, Elena was silent for a very long time. She looked out at the garden, at her mother's gloved hands moving with gentle purpose among the perennials, nurturing things that were real and alive. Finally, she asked, "Is she all right? The assistant, Sophie?" Marcus said, "We have already put measures in place to guarantee her safety. She is not in any danger." Elena gave a small, slow nod, a private acknowledgement. "He must have told her our marriage was nothing more than a business arrangement," she murmured, more to herself than to him, "that he was just waiting for the right time to dissolve the partnership." "That is consistent with the profile he would have constructed," Marcus confirmed. He waited a moment. "She also asked me to express her deepest apologies." Elena gripped the phone, the silence stretching between the city and the lake, the clean scent of fresh water and pine, the soft Midwestern light, her mother's hand now on her shoulder from the open doorway. "Tell her I got her message," Elena said finally, her voice surprisingly steady. "And please, tell her I am so grateful." After she hung up, she remained in the sunroom as the morning light filled the space. She let the bizarre, heavy reality of it all wash over her. The very person who had been a key player in the destruction of her life was now, by her own choice, handing her the schematics for her escape. It was a cruel lesson in how deliverance can sometimes come from the most poisoned of places. She walked back into the house she grew up in, into a kitchen filled with the aroma of brewing coffee and the distant, familiar sound of her father working in his woodshop. Elena sat at the heavy oak table that looked out over the gentle hills of Wisconsin, where each farmhouse seemed perfectly placed in the landscape. The last of the morning mist was burning off the lake, allowing rays of pale sunshine to break through. She thought about what she wanted, not as a countermove, not as a panicked response, but what she, Elena, truly wanted, the way someone does when they finally stop trying to contort themselves into a shape for someone else's approval. She wanted her son to be safe. She wanted him to know, from his very first moment, what a foundation of true peace felt like. She wanted his nursery to be painted the color of the Chicago sky over Lake Michigan just before a summer storm. She wanted to hear her brother David's loud laugh across a crowded dinner table. She wanted Saturday morning trips to the farmer's market with her parents, coffee that was always just right, and the comforting rumble of the L train a few blocks from a home that was entirely her own. She wanted to find the woman she was before Julian, the architectural historian who had fierce convictions about historic preservation, who argued for them with fire, and who never, ever glanced at her husband's face for permission after she spoke. She knew that woman was still in there waiting. She had been silent for far too long. She decided it was time to make some noise. She took a sip of her coffee. That afternoon, Julian ignored the attorney's directive to cease all contact. He called her cell phone at 11:14. She watched his name light up the screen and let the call roll to voicemail. He called again at 11:19. She hit the silence button. At 11:22, a text message appeared. Elena, we can't let lawyers do this to us. This is about our child. Please, call me. She took a screenshot and sent it to David. Then she put her phone face down on the granite countertop and went outside to the garden to find her mother. David called back 40 minutes later. His voice had a new edge to it she was starting to recognize. The unmistakable sound of a hunter who had just watched his target step willingly into a snare. He just incriminated himself, Elena, the lawyer said, his voice sharp. For the first time since this started, we are driving the narrative. Elena held on to that word, we. She cherished it. Tell me the next step, she said. First thing in the morning, the lawyer responded. I have a call scheduled with the Board of Trustees for the Chicago Preservation Trust. 3 days later, the trustees of the Chicago Preservation Trust convened an emergency meeting. Julian arrived at 7:58 for the 8 o'clock meeting, moving with the unshakable confidence he brought to every negotiation. He was a vision of controlled power, exuding an aura of absolute authority that had been cultivated over a career of consistently being the most brilliant man in the room. He held a single slim tablet and wore a custom navy suit, the one he reserved for days when reality needed to be bent to his will. He was running on 4 hours of sleep, but appeared as though he'd had a full 8. He strode through the glass doors of the boardroom and stopped cold. The entire configuration of the room was wrong. 3 trustees he considered his most loyal allies were positioned at the far end of the immense marble table, nowhere near their usual seats. They were seated beside 2 of the city's most revered philanthropists, men he had always dismissed as ceremonial figures, not actual players. This new arrangement was deliberate. It was a clear message that anyone familiar with the language of power could read instantly. It was the staging for an ambush, a meeting called not to discuss, but to announce. Julian Croft was an expert at this game. Arthur, he said, addressing the chairman of the board, what is all this about? Arthur Hayes was 74, a man who had helped guide the city's architectural legacy through recessions and booms. His expression was one of practiced neutrality, the kind born from weathering so many corporate gales that he had become immune to their force. It's your foundation, Julian, he answered plainly. Have a seat. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 17 minutes. For the majority of the first hour, Julian commanded the room. He was composed, incisive, and devastatingly logical, having arrived prepared for a challenge. He dismissed the recent media whispers as a coordinated attack by business rivals. He described Elena's legal action As a painful domestic issue, the lashing out of a spouse under immense personal strain, and he swore it posed no material risk to the firm's stability. He insisted that taking a leave of absence would be read by the markets as an admission of weakness. The investors listened, their faces unreadable. Then the private equity partners began their questions. Their inquiries were sharp and precise, referencing specific wire transfers, funds moved to a shell company named the Elysian Group, payments for a Gold Coast condo that wasn't on the company's books, the exact date of a quiet amendment to his prenuptial agreement, and a significant liquidation of development bonds into a private, untraceable account. They knew everything. Sometime in the second hour, it struck Julian that this information hadn't been gathered in a frantic search. It had been assembled with surgical care by auditors who knew exactly what they were looking for and who'd been given the master key to find it. He knew, in that sickening flash of clarity, who had given it to them. After 2 hours and 17 minutes, the partners voted, 7-2, a mandatory indefinite leave of absence, pending a full forensic audit of his capital expenditure accounts and private servers, to be handled by an independent firm. The chief operating officer, Amelia Reyes, was appointed interim president, effective immediately. A press release already vetted by 3 different law firms was set to go live at 4:15 in the afternoon. Julian left the meeting at 4:23. He walked through the grand marble-floored lobby he had personally overseen the restoration of, a monument to old-world power that he had revived, striding past junior associates who suddenly became fascinated by the grain of the wood paneling and senior partners who found the view of the lake utterly absorbing. He moved past the interns, whose gazes fell to the polished floors with synchronized haste. He took the private brass elevator down 52 floors, pushed through the revolving doors, and stepped out onto a windswept, rain-dampened Michigan Avenue. A pair of business journalists, reporters he had cultivated for favorable stories for years, were waiting. They didn't shout a single question. They just lifted their cameras and documented the tightening of his jaw, his driver pulling the Escalade to the curb with panicked speed, and the graceless scramble of a man whose entire persona was built on projecting unshakable power, now escaping the very city skyline his name was meant to define. Eliza was oblivious to all of this. She was on her knees on a paint-splattered tarp in the spare room of her sister's Wicker Park apartment, putting together a bookshelf. Her sister, Maria, had brought it over that morning, declaring that building something new is 1,000,000 times better for the spirit than staring at the wreckage of something old. It was made of solid oak with a simple modern design and strong, clean lines. The scent of fresh-cut wood and varnish filled the room, a smell that felt like the beginning of something solid and real. Maria was helping. This mainly involved her sitting on a stack of boxes, strumming a dented acoustic guitar, and offering a stream of truly terrible advice. She had just finished a song about the existential angst of an Allen key when she tried to convince Eliza that a main support bracket was probably optional. "Liza, I am 95% sure that's just for decoration," she had stated with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never read an instruction manual in her life. But her presence and her ridiculously upbeat music was making Eliza laugh. It wasn't the restrained, polite laugh she deployed at zoning board meetings and charity galas, but a real one, the kind that starts deep in your chest and takes you by surprise. It was the most honest she had felt in weeks. It was, without a doubt, the best moment of her week. By 6 o'clock, the work was finished. The bookshelf stood against the wall, its warm wood glowing in the late afternoon sun. One of the screws was slightly stripped, a permanent reminder of their 15-minute argument about the correct Phillips head screwdriver. But it was sturdy. It was finished. It was ready. Maria stood back, dusting her hands on her jeans. "We made that," she said, with the genuine wonder of someone who had just witnessed a small miracle. "You handed me the wrong dowel 5 times, Eliza pointed out. "I was creating opportunities for problem solving. It's an advanced collaboration technique," she retorted. Eliza ran a hand along the smooth oak, admiring its deep grain and its one tiny flaw. The baby gave a slow, deliberate turn against her ribs, a quiet response to the day's work, and the shifting world beyond the apartment window. Eliza rested her hand over the movement. A profound ache in her shoulders, a tension she had carried for so long she had accepted it as part of herself, started to ease. Maria noticed the change in her expression. She didn't say anything. She just came and stood in the doorway beside her, and for a moment they both just looked at the bookshelf in the twilight, the thing they had built, the thing that was waiting. Their mother, Sophia, found them there a few minutes later. She paused on the threshold, her eyes taking in the scene, the new bookshelf, her two daughters, the sense of quiet accomplishment that filled the space. She looked at them for a long moment, a woman seeing something more precious and resilient than she had allowed herself to imagine. "Have you thought of a name?" she asked, her voice gentle. The list Eliza had saved on her laptop was gone, deleted 2 nights before. Every name on it felt like it belonged to another person, another life. She looked at the bookshelf. "Leo," she said. "For Grandpa." Sophia made a small, sharp sound, not quite a sob, but something very near to it. It wasn't a dramatic declaration, just a statement of newfound clarity. She nodded once. She looked at the bookshelf one more time. "He would have loved that," she said, her voice soft but sure. "He would have been so proud." That night, Eliza was awake in her sister's guest room at 2 a.m. It wasn't fear or anger. It was the sharp, crystalline calm of a person who knows their world has been leveled but cannot yet see what will be built in its place. She thought of the architectural plans she'd found on the shared server for a luxury condo in a building he didn't even own. She thought of the invoices for artwork from Sasha's gallery, pieces he had always claimed to detest. She thought of Julian that morning, meticulously adjusting his $1,000 tie, and she thought of 6 years spent systematically chipping away at her own ambitions, making her designs less bold, more conventional, less of a challenge to his own. She thought of the awards dinner where she'd let a developer explain her own design principles back to her. She thought, "I was so afraid of the person I was becoming in his world. I was afraid that if I kept going, I would just disappear, that one day there would be nothing left of the woman I used to be." And then the next thought, the one that was finally taking root, "But this is the person I'm becoming now." She placed a hand over her womb. Her daughter kicked as if to concur. It seemed that being awake at 2 a.m. was a trait they were already passing down. She took a breath. She held her position. The updated marital assets agreement was contested in court just 1 month after the revelation. Lena's new attorney, a formidable man named Harrison, assembled his case with the calculated precision of a grandmaster. The receipts for the undeclared sports car were his opening gambit. The supposed wealth management consultant who had rubber-stamped the division of their portfolio was unmasked as the principal of a boutique firm that was secretly bankrolled by Arthur's holding company. For a consultant to provide valid advice, they must be a neutral third party. The assertion that their family's financial planner had approved the 11th hour revisions to the prenup was disproven by the planner's own flight itineraries, private messages, and a formal declaration stating he was out of the country on that date and had never laid eyes on the amendment. The portfolio of overseas properties, which Arthur had sold to an exhausted and pregnant Lena as a clever international investment strategy, was exposed for what it was through encrypted messages between him and his offshore broker, where they strategized the most effective ways to conceal the holdings, so that she would not investigate further. Arthur's legal representation was a behemoth, a squadron of elite litigators from a prestigious New York firm supported by an army of associates. Mr. Harrison was simply smarter. A judge issued a court order freezing all disputed assets until an exhaustive forensic accounting could be completed. Lena's divorce petition referenced the conditions of their original prenuptial agreement, a document drafted 6 years ago by a woman who was convinced she was creating a future with a genuine partner. The board of directors at Vance Development launched its own internal investigation. Their conclusions, written in the cold, dispassionate language of corporate damage control, pointed to a significant misapplication of corporate resources for acquisitions unrelated to company business. Arthur's temporary leave of absence was formally changed to a termination of employment. An agreement was reached. It was negotiated swiftly and brutally by intermediaries. On one side stood Arthur's personal lawyers and the public relations crisis firm he had retained. On the other, the board's counsel and, watching from a distance, Mr. Harrison. The entire matter was concluded in 8 days. Arthur's compelled resignation was announced publicly. He departed with a severance payment that was a slap in the face for his years of service, bound by a non-disclosure agreement that was airtight. Sarah Jenkins was appointed as the new acting chief executive officer. Sarah phoned Lena herself to deliver the update. Her tone was businesslike, direct. Just before ending the call, she said, "I ought to have raised a flag sooner. I noticed things this past year, discrepancies in the capital expenditure reports that seemed off. I let it go. I'm sorry." Lena replied, "You spoke up when it was crucial. You went to the board when it was crucial." A long pause hung between them. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice filled with sincere gratitude. "I truly do." "I know," Lena said, and it was true. The shell corporations were dissolved, their holdings sold off. The company started to find its footing under Sarah's capable leadership. Arthur's father, one of the firm's founding partners, quietly liquidated his entire ownership stake. He never issued a public comment about the situation. He didn't need to. Lena found a brownstone in the South End. She discovered it with her sister on a crisp autumn day, strolling through streets she hadn't wandered for a decade. She had forgotten, after 8 years, in Arthur's minimalist world of glass and chrome, how much she craved the historic charm of a city like Boston. The cobblestone alleys of Beacon Hill, the salty air from the harbor, the small independent bookshops with their creaking floors. Her new haven was a stately corner unit in a historic residential block. It featured original crown molding, tall, elegant fireplaces, and a row of bay windows that filled the rooms with a gentle amber light. The view was a classic city scene of brick sidewalks and the distant rhythm of urban life, but it was a view that was entirely hers. She made the space her own. She painted the grand living room a color called Atlantic Mist. It was a deep, complex gray blue. Her sister, while standing in the center of the half-painted room that Sunday, commented, "You realize this is nearly the identical shade of the old velvet seats at the Symphony Hall." Lena gazed at the wall. "Really?" she asked quietly. "A perfect resonance," her sister stated. Nothing else had to be said. Some harmonies are simply understood. She put together the antique writing desk herself in the nook that received the best afternoon light. It was a gorgeous cherry wood piece she had wanted for ages, and it had a minor, almost imperceptible flaw in the finish near the leg. She thought about having it replaced, but ultimately chose not to. It was sturdy. It would be a fine place to write. She was adopting a new philosophy: to quit pursuing an immaculate outcome in moments that were already wonderful. She found a reading chair for the opposite corner, a classic leather armchair that was perfectly broken in. She turned it toward the window to observe the people strolling along the avenue. She settled into it for the first time on a peaceful Friday morning. By herself, in her new Boston home, she surveyed the environment she had arranged for her next chapter. The waiting desk, the comfortable chair, the deep blue of the wall visible just past her stack of books. The faint, soulful wail of a distant ship's horn floated in from the harbor, a low, constant note. A sense of calm settled over her, not a triumphant fanfare, but something quiet and certain. I composed this. This is my narrative. It was a perfectly formed idea, and she held it close, letting it fill the quiet with all the reassurance she needed in that moment. She started therapy sessions on Thursdays. Dr. Anya Sharma was in her late 50s with a razor-sharp intellect and a steady, grounding presence that could absorb any degree of turmoil. She knew how to lead people through their own psychological landscapes without ever letting them feel disoriented. She never approached Lena like a problem that needed solving. Her empathy was palpable. She would listen intently, pose a deceptively simple question, and then allow the answer to reverberate through the following week. During their third session, she remarked, "It's interesting that your talent for investigation never disappeared. You simply stopped trusting your own findings." Lena mulled that over for the next 7 days. She recalled a dinner party, how she had stayed quiet during a conversation about unethical zoning practices, a topic she had once covered extensively. She considered the 5 years she had presented a more subdued, less inquisitive version of herself. "I knew the real story," she thought. "I always sensed it. I just began to think I wasn't supposed to be the one to uncover it." In their 5th session, she declared, "I need to reconnect with the woman I was before I met Arthur." That woman had a fire inside her and was never afraid to ask uncomfortable questions. Dr. Sharma inquired, "And where do you suppose she went?" Lena answered, "She learned to be silent, but I know she is still in here." Dr. Sharma offered a small smile. "Oh, I'm quite certain that story was never finished." Chloe sent one desperate voicemail. It arrived as a single sterile paragraph in an automated booking confirmation. Clara was perched on a cardboard box in her half-empty living room on a Tuesday morning, her tea growing tepid beside her. She read the confirmation once, noting the 2 names on the reservation, neither of which was hers. Then she permanently blocked the sender and erased the message. She never looked at it again, but she saved a screenshot to a password-protected cloud drive. Some evidence is for preservation, not immediate prosecution. During a video chat with Sophie one October evening, Clara admitted, "You know what I can't get out of my head? The writer I was before him. She was so audacious. She had these sprawling, messy concepts for novels and just threw them at the page without a second thought." "So where did she go?" Sophie asked, her voice a comforting presence across the miles. Clara hesitated. "I think I started editing my first drafts as I was writing them because it felt less vulnerable," she said. "I convinced myself I was being practical, that I was just being a good partner to someone with a demanding career." After a beat, she added, "I'm planning her comeback tour." Sophie's voice was full of certainty. "I never thought she left. She was just in the green room, waiting for her cue to walk on stage." Clara let out a long, shuddering breath. "Yeah." The ensuing silence was deep and comfortable, built on a shared history. "Yeah," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. On a brisk Friday in December at 6:42 in the morning, Clara Bishop gave birth to a daughter. The labor had been an epic, lasting 21 hours. Her sister, Sophie, was there for every moment of it. She was an oasis of calm in the clinical storm, a presence that asked for nothing. She had an uncanny sense of when to offer a piece of ice, whispered encouragement when the contractions peaked, and applied steady, grounding pressure to Clara's lower back when the pain threatened to tear her in two. She was simply there. She had played this role before for the people she cherished, in other fluorescent lit rooms, and she knew the most vital contribution was to be an unwavering witness. The day before, she had shown up with a tote bag filled with 3 flavors of coconut water, a flask of peppermint tea, a dense history of female explorers she had no intention of opening but felt was good karma, and a small, smooth river stone from the coast. She declared the stone was for the baby, but was also her temporary spirit guide, a piece of reasoning Clara found perfectly logical. She set up a command post in the corner chair, firing off text messages that were, without exception, relentlessly positive. With no blueprints to review or deals to close, Arthur paced the corridor. He moved with the caged animal tension of a man who'd reshaped a city's skyline, but was now faced with a single locked door he had no key for. He was, in effect, a monument of focused intention achieving absolutely nothing. For 18 hours, his expensive leather shoes traced a silent, repeating path on the sterile linoleum of the birthing center. The nurses, veterans of such vigils, charted his movements and navigated around him like a fixed landmark. Twice, they brought him black coffee in a paper cup, which he took with the dazed politeness of someone whose every need was usually met by a paid assistant. Arthur was not in the delivery room. Catherine had ensured that. The separation was in the hands of their attorneys now. Communication was a brokered transaction. While the legal logic for his absence was sound, the emotional truth was simpler. As she lay in the suite near dawn, in that strange, hyper-aware calm that can descend during intense pain, a single thought crystallized. There is no one in here I have to flatter. There is no one in here who needs me to be smaller. There is no one here I need to manage. There was only the task at hand and the person she cherished most. And then a noise, abrupt, furious, and utterly demanding, as if Theodore himself was outraged by his sudden eviction. It was as if he'd been thrust into this new world, found its conditions immediately unacceptable, and was lodging his formal protest with the kind of raw, unfiltered power only a newborn possesses. Chloe laughed, a sound that was deep, immediate, and drenched in relief. It was the laugh of a person who'd been straining to hear a specific, beautiful note her entire life and had finally, at long last, heard it played. In the next instant, she was weeping, openly and without reservation, right there in the delivery suite. The tears of someone who has protected a fragile dream for so long and has just seen it made real. Chloe Davies cried in that room without an ounce of self-consciousness, and it was one of the most honest things Catherine had ever witnessed. Arthur was allowed in. He stood beside the bed, gazing at his son, so tiny, so flushed, and so profoundly annoyed by his recent change in residence, a critique he was delivering with a relentless, powerful wail. His composure shattered in a way Catherine had never, in her 36 years of life, seen before. It was a complete unraveling. His entire posture changed, the calculated stillness of his expression melting away in a moment. The facade he had spent 2 decades constructing, the impenetrable negotiation face of a real estate magnate, the methodical way he assessed every angle, the entire complex architecture of Arthur Vance simply collapsed. He was stripped down to the most fundamental human state. A father seeing his child for the first time. "Well, hello there, Theodore," he murmured. Theodore did not respond. He had entered the world with a clear agenda, and though it lacked words, it was being broadcast with remarkable force. This was a child born with a strong opinion, and he was determined to share it. Arthur collapsed into the chair by the bed, reaching for his wife's hand. His gaze, however, remained fixed on his son, his face utterly exposed. There were no defensive walls, no strategic maneuvers. In the months that came after, Catherine started to rebuild. It wasn't a single dramatic event or a series of grand victories, but the slow, methodical work of genuine recovery. It was 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, filled with quiet setbacks and small successes she often only recognized in hindsight. Catherine returned to her work that September when Theo was 9 months old. It wasn't to the university where she'd once been a promising academic, but to a small art advisory she launched with 2 friends from her doctoral program, women she had drifted away from during her marriage. The distance had grown so imperceptibly she hadn't realized she was isolated until she was completely alone. But when she finally called them, her words awkward with the effort of resurrecting a former self, they were simply there, immediately, without a single question about the years of silence. The firm's first quarter was solid. The second was remarkable. She maintained her weekly appointment with Dr. Albright every Tuesday. Gradually, she noticed the substance of their conversations was shifting. She was no longer sifting through the wreckage, the ledgers, the betrayal, the soulless legal negotiations, but was instead surveying new, calmer territory, the woman she was becoming. Her plans for the next chapter, the new identity she was assembling piece by piece, which was not a repaired version of the old one. Because you cannot walk through that kind of fire and expect to emerge without the lingering smell of smoke. And she had finally stopped trying to scrub it away. She was not the same woman she was before Arthur. She was someone who had survived an earthquake. She was someone who had been forced to learn lessons she never would have chosen. She was someone whose sense of self had been remade by crisis, not by design. She was, as she realized one Tuesday afternoon in Dr. Albright's sunlit office, more completely herself than she had ever been. The idea of dating never occurred to her, not that year, not for some time. She knew that not for some time was a description of pace, not a permanent state of being, a difference she was careful to respect. The Beacon Hill townhouse, over many months, became truly hers, in the way that only the quiet repetition of daily life can infuse a place with your soul. She learned which window on the second floor best caught the morning light off the Charles River, and which was perfect for watching the gas lamps flicker on at dusk. She perfected the steeping of her favorite Earl Grey tea, knowing it was right after exactly 4 minutes. She learned that Theo, in his crib, that seemed just a bit too large for him, slept most soundly with the low hum of the city and a thin blade of light from the hallway painting a line across the wide plank floors. She knew these things in the way you know what is truly, profoundly yours. Entirely hers. James and his wife Sophie began coming over for Saturday brunch. These visits, in time, became the anchor of her week. The cozy chaos of her brother's cooking, Sophie's steady presence, and James in the cushioned window seat, bouncing Theo on his knee with an innate ease that suggested years of fatherhood rather than just months of being an uncle. Theo learned the sound of his uncle's laugh early, the way a baby absorbs the frequencies that mean absolute safety and joy. He would turn his head toward the sound of James's heavy footsteps on the stairs, toward that familiar rhythm of Arthur Vance speaking his name. She mentioned it only once, her voice a near whisper to James as they sat in the living room after Sophie had gone home one Saturday. "He knows your laugh," James said. "Of course he does, Catherine. He's crazy about you." She said nothing more. She just held that fact close, the way you hold on to the first sight of land after a long and brutal voyage. On a crisp Thursday morning in November, a year after the discovery, Catherine Vance sat at the small cafe table in her Boston home and sipped a tea that was absolutely perfect. Isabella was sitting on her little wooden duck, a cherished hand-me-down from Chloe's own childhood, its yellow paint worn away in patterns that told a story of happy use. She had dedicated herself that autumn to appreciating things with history, things that were beautifully imperfect. Her daughter was intensely focused on a single page of a well-loved board book, her small brow wrinkled with the concentration of a historian examining a primary source. The gentle, watery light of a New England morning streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It filled the room, illuminating the deep navy blue accent wall behind her television, making her modern seaport apartment feel like a calm, private cove. It was a hopeful light, the kind of light Chloe was training herself to notice and appreciate. It was a deliberate practice, a choice to find meaning in small things, a quiet act of defiance. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, screen down. She hadn't looked at it. For the first 30 minutes of her day, a new personal best that would have been unimaginable for the last 3 years, it stayed there. She hadn't felt that compulsive need to check, that nervous 4-part sequence of pickup, swipe, refresh, put down, hoping for a notification from a man who used his attention as a tool, keeping her in a constant state of deficit. Guessing, always searching. She hadn't even glanced at it. It was just a device on the kitchen counter, lifeless and dark. Willow finally lifted her head from the picture book. Her eyes found her mother's. She had her father's eyes, Julian Croft's eyes, the color of warm amber on a sunny afternoon. But she had Clara's smile, a smile that could broadcast a dozen emotions at once, and she was never hesitant to use it. She set the book down on the rug beside her. She reached out a small, soft hand. She laid it, palm open, against Clara's cheek. The touch was feather-light. It was how a child explores something precious, with pure curiosity and zero agenda. It was the touch of someone who had not yet learned that life demands you build walls around your heart. The touch of a daughter for the woman who was, in that quiet moment, the center of her world. Clara allowed her eyelids to flutter closed. She concentrated on the gentle, warm pressure of her daughter's hand on her skin. This same face, which had once been met with a look of cool indifference, was now the focus of absolute, unqualified adoration. And in that silent moment, with the morning sun warming her face, she realized that this was the real definition of healing. It wasn't some spectacular victory, not a six-figure book deal or a rave review in a major publication, or hearing that Julian's latest high-rise project was a critical failure. It was this quiet, utterly flawless morning. She remembered the home study, the cold blue light of the tablet screen as she stared at the encrypted folder, the file named The Getaway. The nauseating drop in her gut as she saw the hotel confirmations, the intimate dinner reservations for two, the emailed receipt for a vintage watch engraved with an initial that wasn't hers. Her hand shooting up to her mouth to choke back a sound. She remembered sitting in her fully packed car for 15 minutes straight, needing every single second before she could find the strength to start the engine and head toward her new beginning in a new city. The immense, terrifying chasm between the woman frozen by that screen and the one sitting here now. She thought about the prenuptial agreement and the 5 years of quiet erosion, the methodical, subtle chipping away of her creative confidence by a man she had entrusted with her entire being. She thought about assembling Willow's crib right here on this floor with her sister, the two of them dissolving into laughter over the cryptic instructions. She thought about the 2 a.m. feedings, murmuring made-up songs in the armchair beside the charmingly imperfect antique rocking horse in the seafoam green room. She thought about her agent calling to say, "You're not just writing a new chapter, you're starting a whole new book." In the 4 weeks since her doctor had looked her squarely in the eye and spoken those words, Clara had replayed the scene countless times. She saw her brother, Leo, on the phone from his downtown law office, his voice steady and pragmatic as he outlined the immediate next steps before she had even finished telling him what she'd found. She finally realized that the groundwork for her new reality had already been laid. She thought, I just needed to find that one fatal plot twist to finally give myself permission to start writing it. A tiny foot jabbed against the inside of her ribs, a little nudge that was insistent, present, and belonged only to her. Clara opened her eyes. She looked down at her own pregnant belly, a concrete, growing reason to accept nothing less than a completely remade world. Clara smiled. It was not the polished, serene smile she had perfected for architectural galas and Julian's self-important clients, the one she wore for the constant, exhausting work of managing a brilliant man's ego. It was the other kind, the one that ignites deep inside you and appears on your face without permission. The baby, seemingly satisfied with this response, shifted into a softer, rolling motion. She shifted her focus back to a small bowl of fresh blueberries. Clara lifted her coffee mug. Outside her window, the unique pulse of a Seattle morning was gathering momentum. The city's distinct orchestra was tuning up. The low, distant horn of a ferry crossing Puget Sound, the gentle hiss of rain against the glass, and the collective hum of 1,000 people beginning their day. It was the sound of a universe that didn't expect her to be smaller, that wasn't asking her to be a tasteful footnote, a universe that was just moving on and had a place waiting for her. She sat with her coffee and her unborn child in the cool, damp air. She thought about Leo, who would send her a text later because Leo sent a text every single day with the kind of methodical consistency that demonstrated true support wasn't about grand gestures, but about relentless presence. She thought about her Sunday call with her grandmother on Bainbridge Island, surrounded by the quiet beauty of her rose garden, a source of unwavering, gentle wisdom. She thought about her new literary consultancy and the manuscript analysis she had due by end of day, and the bold, genre-bending novel she had championed late on Monday night. After a wave of pregnancy-induced insomnia, she had been on her living room floor, the city lights reflecting off the windows, her own narrative instincts flowing from her mind onto the editorial notes. She was building something she believed in, on her own schedule, without ever stopping to ask if her opinions were what a man like Julian would deem appropriate. She thought, I remember who that writer was. The version of herself she had put on a shelf, the decisive one, the one with an unapologetic love for a messy, ambitious first draft, the one who brought her own ideas to life. She was not the same woman she was before Julian. She was someone new, forged by all of it, by the love she had given so completely and the trust she had offered without reservation, and by the 7 years and the award dinners and the damning hotel reservation and the nursery and the 3 a.m. glasses of water and the exposed brick of her new apartment and the coffee that was, at long last, brewed exactly to her own liking. She was composed of every piece, and she was more authentically herself than she had been in a decade. The baby kicked, a firm tap against her hand where it rested on her belly. This was a recent phenomenon. Her child had strong feelings about her posture and was not afraid to share them. "Message received," Clara said aloud. She adjusted her position in the chair. With a thoughtful motion of her spoon, she mixed marmalade into her oatmeal, arranging slivered almonds on top in a careful pattern. This was her new ritual. Morning sun streamed through the large windows, catching the dust motes as they floated in the air of her spacious brownstone apartment. Everything felt measured, intentional, and above all, hers. The coffee had cooled to the ideal temperature. Outside, Boston was waking up. Lena rested a hand on her belly, feeling the distinct, powerful flutter from her child. She was here, in the quiet center of the life she was forging for them, the one she'd reclaimed, the one she had reconstructed from the wreckage of a flawless deception. And she allowed herself to feel a complete and profound sense of peace. A genuine new beginning, she now understood, was not at all like the fiction they write. It was not a single, dramatic, film-worthy moment. It was not the day the locks were changed on the waterfront penthouse, or the day the story of Arthur's affair with his interior designer Chloe spread through their social circles, or the day he was pressured into a buyout by his own partners. It appeared like this: sunlight on a polished floor, the aroma of brewing coffee, and the unspoken promise of the new life developing inside her, a life that would have her own family name, with the unwavering confidence of a person who had never been taught to apologize for her presence. It appeared like continuing on. It appeared like being right here, on this ordinary morning, entirely herself, with no performance to maintain, and no one's temperament to manage but her own and her baby's. A more muted, more agreeable version of herself was not necessary in this place. It appeared like this. Exactly like this. Closing statement. This narrative was thoughtfully conceived, written, and edited by our creative team, with the primary intention of sharing resonant human stories and valuable life insights with our audience. Every story is developed to serve as a reminder that your own path is significant, your inner strength is vast, and the next part of your story is always waiting for you to write it.